Hello, my name is Delayna Spencer, Commissioning Editor for the Social Science for Social Justice series, and joining me today is Hongwei Bao, Associate Professor of Media Studies and author of Queering the Asian Diaspora, which we're here to discuss today. When I was commissioning the next set of books for the series, I was really keen to have a book which captured and celebrated the Asian diasporic consciousness which was emerging, and which also pushed against the anti-Asian sentiment that was on the rise in the wake of COVID-19. Hongwei's book adds to the growing body of work which discusses Asian identity, but also provides a foundational piece on contemporary Asian queer identity. So, Hongwei, your book is a joyful celebration of queer East and Southeast Asian culture. Can you speak a bit about the need to write it and the voices that you were trying to capture?
Thank you, Delayna, for your wonderful introduction, and thanks, Sage, for publishing the book. The book was the result of my observation as well as activism in the past few years. In particular, since the start of the pandemic, we saw a surge of anti-Asian racism in the West globally. At the same time, we saw Asian communities really actively organizing and voicing their opinions, at the same time discussing issues about what is Asian identity and how would Asian diasporic identity look like. And a lot of these activisms, artwork, as well as discussions feed into my book called Queering the Asian Diaspora.
Thank you. You speak about feeling, and this is a quote from the book, an outsider in and out of China. Can you elaborate on this and how the book has emerged from a liminal space?
Yes. So the three keywords in the title, queer, Asian, and diaspora, are three subject positions that I occupy at different times, sometimes intersectionally. So in China, as a queer person, I didn't feel very comfortable. So I had difficulty coming out, to even to my parents, to family, to society, and so on. At the same time, there was very strong, in a way, patriarchal and heteronormative pressure for all citizens. So all people need to conform to a certain lifestyle and so on, which I didn't feel comfortable with. When I left China and came to the UK, I also felt that the Asian diaspora community that I'm familiar with also took homosexuality or queer issues as a taboo issue. So a lot of people of the older generation didn't like to talk about LGBTQ plus issues. They sometimes refuse to acknowledge LGBT issues, seeing queerness as a Western import. It only exists in Western societies. So this really bothers me. At the same time, the LGBTQ communities that I live in the West, in the UK at least, is very diverse, but at times you can still see practices of racism, in particular, the kind of objectification and sexualization of the Asian men and women. So essentially, those identities and those interlocking structures became the impetus for my writing.
Thank you. You talk about the LGBTQIA plus community in the West still kind of having that racism which exists in the global North. And I guess, usually when you think of that community, we think of how progressive it is and how far along it's come and the things that they're fighting towards. But can you speak about, I guess, how racism and race intersects with that community?
Yeah, definitely. So let me first clarify that the LGBTQ communities in the West, at least in the UK society where I'm living now, is very diverse and people are very friendly. And there are a lot of opportunities of raising ethnic minority voices. However, there's still some way to go. For example, if you turn on the kind of social media app and read people's, for example, profiles or social media messages, etc., they sometimes still put words such as no Asian and no blacks. So those blatant expressions of racism. But this is not discussed much in the gay community because people think that this is a private issue. This is personal preference. It has got nothing to do with racism. But I would argue in my book that it is. And of course, sometimes ethnic minorities are sometimes sexualized or sometimes over-sexualized. For example, so when people actually are seeing, hearing about a queer Asian, they think, have in mind a kind of effeminate and really ladyboy type of person. And of course, I mean, there's nothing wrong to be effeminate, and there should be a celebration of different genders and sexualities, but there's usually a prejudice attached to such stereotyping. So my suggestion is really that there should not be so much stereotyping, and there should not be value attached to those stereotyping of sexual and gender minority communities.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to ask about one of the words in the title, so queer and that concept of queering. Could you speak a bit more about that and how you use it, I guess, as a verb?
Yep. So queer, of course, I mean, used to be a derogatory term, especially in the English language. However, from the 1980s and 90s, queer activists and scholars have appropriated this term for positive use. So we have queer cinema, queer politics, etc. And of course, with the globalization of sexual identities and politics, the term queer has also been translated into different Asian languages. For example, in Chinese language, queer is transliterated as ku'er, literally a cool kid. So the term has gained some purchase in different communities as a positive identification or as a type of sexual politics, and it's essentially a type of anti-identitarian politics as opposed to the gay identity politics, which presumably, I mean, advocates a kind of homonormativity, but queerness really celebrates different types of genders and sexualities and so on. So in my book, I use the term queer both as a noun to refer to an umbrella term for gender sexual minorities and anti-identitarian sexual politics, as well as a verb to queer, which means to destabilize, to trouble, or to problematize the heteronormative bias in our everyday language and in some community practices. Queering the Asian diaspora is not only to, in a way, to find the voices of queer Asians in the diaspora and celebrate their voices, but also to question, to problematize the heteronormative bias within the Asian communities overall.
Thank you. You spoke about queer as an umbrella term, and I wanted to move on to EC or ESEA, which is East and Southeast Asian, which is being used more and more. I know the terminology didn't come about just in 2020, but it has gained in popularity since then. And it reminds me of BAME, of course, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. And I think there are some positives and negatives in having that kind of umbrella term. I think on one hand, you have a set of marginalized identities who are able to come together under a shared sense of oppression. But I think on the other hand, you can flatten those oppressions and I guess not see them as distinct. And those oppressions are very, they vary depending on which community you're speaking about, and that can lead to not having a good understanding of what an Asian person experiences, what a Black person experiences, and of course, minority ethnic, that's a whole bunch of different identities. So you're really not able to see someone for that one identity that they inhibit. And I guess I wanted to ask how you feel about the emerging EC identity and how you feel terms like this work or don't work.
That's a great question. So let me first respond by distinguishing the two terms. The first term is BAME, Black and Asian Minority Ethnic, which is the UK government's official designation for all ethnic minorities. And of course, ethnic minorities, a global majority, feel differently about the term, partly because this term erases all the differences. And of course, another reason is that it is a top-down term imposed by the government rather than coming from the communities. For example, the EC community, East and Southeast Asian community, feel very much marginalized or invisible under such designation. So although the BAME has an A, has Asian in it, but traditionally Asian is usually understood as South Asian in the UK's population. So a lot of East and Southeast Asian people feel that they have not been represented in this kind of official statistics. I mean, in the national census, for example, many people may have to choose terms such as I belong to Asian other in order to find out their position, in order to identify. So this form of identification actually proved to be problematic for the East and Southeast Asian communities. In recent years, actually, in response to the kind of rising anti-Asian racism, so East and Southeast Asian communities came up with this term by themselves, saying that we want to be called ESEA or EC, and this distinguishes from, for example, Chinese community. This also distinguishes from South Asian community, which has a longer history in the UK. So in a way, actually, this has its own positives. For example, it's able to bring together disparate population actually together to articulate a shared experience, the shared experience of marginalization and racism. But at the same time, it also, of course, not every community or not every person is happy with the term, as with all the umbrella terms, as you have mentioned. So I think that at the moment, EC actually is becoming a kind of, at least more and more mainstream and widely accepted. For example, we have EC Heritage Month, although not officially recognized by the UK government. We have EC Literary Festival, or LitFest, that celebrates EC writers, and we also have EC Film Festival, EC organizations, and so on. So Manchester's Chinese Art Center changes its name to EC Contemporary, which are all recent developments. And under these umbrella terms, I think that a lot of people are doing great work to bring communities together. The term EC actually should be used for anti-colonial and anti-racist purposes. It shouldn't create more divisions and hierarchies and exclusions. And of course, the term EC hasn't taken effective account into gender and sexual minorities, the kind of heteronormative and patriarchal bias within the EC community as a result of the kind of Confucian, EC heritage, and so on needs to be problematized. So that's also another reason that I'm writing the book, which is an intervention into the contemporary EC cultural politics, advocating a kind of intersectional as well as a more diverse cultural EC cultural politics.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. And that actually moves into something else that I wanted to ask you about, which was the erasure of queer Asian identity, which you speak about in the book, and the long-lasting impact that that's had. Could you go into a bit more detail about that, about how there has been that erasure and what the book does to unpack it and challenge it, and also presents, I guess, examples, cases that people can look to which celebrate their identity?
That's a great question. So, well, as a queer Asian myself, I have long felt that my life what isn't recognized, isn't validated, and isn't visible in society because I don't see EC people like myself on media and in books and in all kinds of representation and in politics and so on. So this is a problem. And many EC members or queer Asian community members that I've met actually have suffered from mental health issues and depression and so on. They felt that that their life is not important enough. So I think this has many reasons. Of course, a kind of invisibility of queer Asian identity is at stake. I mean, in queer community, I mean, people often associate queerness with kind of white and Western identity. So Asian queers may not feel queer enough within that community. And then in the kind of Asian community, there's also a strong, in a way, conservative, homophobic sentiment. I think that this doesn't help queer Asian people's mental health. So what I hope to do with this book is really to highlight all these fantastic EC cultural workers, activists, and change makers and community organizations. So the readers can get inspiration from those great examples and case studies so that they hopefully can also be inspired to be social changers themselves.
And that moves nicely on to the next question I had for you, which is, who do you envision this book being for, and who do you think will most appreciate it?
I like to see that this book is for everyone. So everyone who's interested in reading queerness and Asian identity and migration diaspora issues. But of course, I mean, specifically, I think that this book was specifically written for the queer Asian community living in the diaspora because it discusses some of the issues and some of the dilemmas as well as politics within the queer Asian community. And also, I would also highlight that this is an interdisciplinary as well as transdisciplinary book. So the book has wonderful examples of contemporary art, fashion photography, of theater and performance, of social and political activism. So I also hope that those who are interested in social activism, in particular cultural activism, would be interested in reading this book. So the book is a book for humanities as well as for social sciences.
Your first case study in the book revolves around the rabbit god, Shen. Can you speak to the origin of the rabbit deity and the interesting ways that he's been reimagined for a contemporary audience?
Yeah, definitely. So this is a chapter that I really like because I'm a big fan of the rabbit god. For those who don't know, rabbit god is a ancient Chinese or god for LGBTQ plus people. So it came from a kind of classical 17th century story of a man who fell in love with another person but were executed because of his gay love. And when he goes to the underworld, the king of the underworld crowned him as the god, the rabbit god, blessing all the LGBTQ plus people. It's a beautiful story, but of course, I mean, the ancient classical text didn't cover much. I mean, it was only a couple of paragraphs. So what I found was that Asian diasporic and queer cultural producers are making interesting artwork using this story. For example, in chapter 1, I analyzed 3 artist work, including L.G. Jiang's work and Andrew Thomas Huang's work, as well as Scotty Sou's work. So they are Asian diaspora based in different parts of the world, in Melbourne, Australia, in Toronto, in Canada, as well as in LA, in the USA. But inevitably, they turn to the Rabbi God story and reinvent the story. For example, in Andrew Thomas Huang's story, which is a film which you can find on the YouTube called Kiss of the Rabbi God. So Huang imagines the Rabbi God actually to be a kind of fashionable young people visiting a Chinatown restaurant and then fall in love with a kitchen hand, a ordinary restaurant worker in a Chinatown restaurant, and then fall in love and inspired him to pursue his own true love. So this is a fascinating story about Asian migration experience in the USA and the living conditions of some of them, especially those who work in Chinatown restaurants, as well as a kind of bold celebration of queer desire, not necessarily drawing on symbols such as a rainbow flag and pride and so on, but drawing on the ancient Chinese story of the Rabbi God. So the Rabbi God became a kind of a way to empower them, a way to imagine the possibility of queer Asian identity, sexuality, and existence. I find this is a beautiful example. So by writing about those stories, I do not mean that there is this origin of queer Asian myth that everybody should go back to, but to say that here there is this kind of indigenous tradition. The tradition should be used, revitalized for contemporary purposes. Don't stick to what ancient God was, but what it can become for our own purposes, whether it's the purpose of writing about someone else's biography or articulate some contemporary concerns such as anti-Asian racism, or talk about issues such as labor politics. So in a way, I find those art works, innovative and interesting. I want to, in a way, celebrate those artworks as well as celebrate the queer Asian identity. So in a way, queer Asian identity, like the Rabbi God, shouldn't stay the same. They should be reinvented and reimagined and fabulated and imagined in wildest way possible.
Oh, thank you so much, Hongwei. I feel like your answer to that question especially gives people a real taste of the richness of the book. So I hope that really encourages people to go and read it. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you again for taking part in the series as well.
Thank you, Delayna, for these wonderful discussions.